Hello, everyone. Thank you for joining us. My name is Jack Ferguson. I'm a Soren Fellow and the co-chair of this year's Bread of Life dinner. We're delighted to have you all here with us tonight. I'd like to thank the DCEC staff for helping put this together, and especially our faculty representatives this evening, faculty and staff for joining us. I'm now delighted to introduce our speaker. Professor Jenny Martin is a professor in the program of liberal studies with a concurrent appointment in the Department of Theology, where she researches 19th and 20th century Roman Catholic and Eastern Orthodox thought, theological aesthetics, and religion and literature. She earned her PhD in systematic theology here at Notre Dame. She began teaching in PLS in 2012. She teaches the theology classes as well as the Great Book seminars in PLS. And as a freshman, I was lucky enough to take her as my very first PLS class, which was a lot of fun. She's remained a student favorite. Just last spring, she was awarded the Frank O'Malley Undergraduate Teaching Award and was recognized at commencement. Her first book, Hans Urs von Balthasar and the Critical Appropriation of Russian Religious Thought, was published just a few years ago in 2015 and dealt with the engagement of Soviet-era religious philosophy and the Swiss theologian Hans Urs von Balthasar, and she's currently working on her second book, dealing with French ressourcement theology. She also serves on the editorial board of the journal Religion and Literature. And tonight, Professor Martin joins us to offer her reflection titled Human Dignity and the Liberal Arts, a Modest Proposal. Friends, please join me in welcoming Professor Jenny Martin.
Good evening, all of you. I'm so grateful to be here speaking with you tonight about this topic. And I'll jump right in because I know you'll be waiting on your entrees. I better talk fast. I'll begin. Human Dignity and the Liberal Arts, a Modest Proposal. In his deeply ironic 1729 essay, A Modest Proposal for Preventing the Children of Poor People in Ireland from Being a Burden on Their Parents or Country, and for Making Them Beneficial to Their Public, Jonathan Swift offers what he presents as a neat, efficient, hardly objectionable solution to population control, poverty, and the abject living conditions of Ireland. The language that Swift uses is disguised as innocuous, lulling his audience into agreement that the solution he proffers is indeed, as he claims, innocent, cheap, easy, and effectual, and meant only for the public good of the country, by advancing our trade, providing for infants, relieving the poor, and giving some pleasure to the rich. We will all remember, however, what Swift's solution to these societal burdens entails. And here I quote, "I've been assured," he writes rather blandly, "by a very knowing American of my acquaintance in London, that a young, healthy child, well nursed, is, at a year old, a most delicious, nourishing, and wholesome food, whether stewed, roasted, baked, or boiled. And I make no doubt that it will serve equally in a fricassee or a ragout." He pushes the boundaries of decency even further, suggesting pragmatically that for the especially thrifty, the skin of these children's carcasses can be repurposed for gloves or summer boots. In this very short essay, Swift satirically presents devastating acts of violence, breeding poor children for food for the express purpose of their consumption by the rich, in the language of a quite reasonable accommodation to the zeitgeist of his culture. I want to suggest this evening that the modern moment is replete with similar modest proposals, though stripped entirely of Swift's charming yet pointed irony, such that horrifying and violent means are presented with respect to entirely dubious ends in the unobjectionable language of rights and of freedoms. I'll also offer my own modest proposal, namely that the liberal arts can help to build a taxonomy of affect, empathy, and other such resources to recognize the inherent and even constitutive immodesty of such modest proposals, as well as equip us with the intellectual, imaginative, and rhetorical resources to counter them with clarity, creativity, and care. Insofar as reading deeply in the liberal arts can resonate with readers, not only intellectually, but also sensorially and affectively, they can perhaps counterintuitively cultivate a certain clarity of thought. Here I follow with appreciation the main lines of argument from Martha Nussbaum's book, The Fragility of Goodness, which notes particularly the power of reading ancient Greek drama, which includes often, in addition to an intellectual response, a visceral and emotional one. We discover what we think, she writes, partly by noticing how we feel. This instinctual affective response to narrative, as evidenced probably even in this cursory reading of Swift's satire above, aid careful readers in knowing bodily, viscerally, intuitively what is true and what rings false. So tonight I'll highlight two particular resources in the liberal arts tradition for our collective consideration this evening. First, that the liberality of the liberal arts indicates a kind of freedom which controverts the ersatz freedom that pervades the discourse of neoliberal politics. And second, that texts from the liberal arts tradition, especially those from ancient Greek literature, history, and drama, can with devastation and near surgical precision entirely lay bare the operation of force, where, to borrow a phrase from Thucydides, the strong do what they can and the weak suffer what they must. The naked exposure of force in these antique texts can function, I want to argue, as reproach and rebuff to our own culture's clandestine smuggling of force against the weak in the guise of the pretense of moderation, wellness, and civility. In Evangelium Vitae, St. John Paul II noted that the broad sectors of public opinion justify certain crimes against life in the name of the rights of individual freedom, and that such justifications are increasingly not only socially acceptable, but also to be preferred as rational, progressive, and enlightened. Such widespread cultural conditioning, he thinks, has compromised the formation of conscience, making moral judgments and calculations far muddier. Furthermore, the mildness and neutrality of the language deployed, for example, calling a fetus medical waste or tissue, operates almost wholly to disguise the fact that what is involved is the right to life of an actual human person. Jonathan Swift was obviously very familiar with such rhetorical strategy. When he speaks of poor women and children, he subtly introduces into the conversation the language of animal husbandry. Wives get described as breeders, and children are compared, actually unfavorably, to sheep, cattle, and swine as saleable commodities, albeit unprofitable ones, as the needs and costs of their care easily outpace any profit that might be generated by selling them. And from animal husbandry, there's only a small and almost imperceptible slide into commodifying poor children as meat for the wealthy man's table. Because political discussions of beginning of life issues, particularly abortion, have become so entangled with assumptions that govern how the language of freedom gets defined and deployed, I think a careful examination of the meaning of the liberal in the liberal arts can be instructive for disentangling popular, though entirely counterfeit versions of freedom from the genuine article. The distorted, self-centered understanding of freedom that predominates what JP2 has famously called the culture of death is completely individualistic, shorn from any connection to objective or universal truths, and too easily devolves into the exercise of the rights and freedoms in the service of the interest of the strong, however much proclaimed under the banner and even in the name of the common good. Genuine freedom, however, that respects and is motivated by the protection of human dignity and the incomparable worth of every single human being, possesses an inherently relational dimension that is oriented not to the advancement of private interest, but rather to truth as such and to a community of others. So how can reflection upon the liberal arts aid in uneclipsing the nature and exercise of genuine freedom in contemporary culture? In the context of their classical and medieval development, the 7 liberal arts, grammar, logic, rhetoric, arithmetic, geometry, music, and astronomy, were distinguished from the so-called mechanical or servile arts, which included the study of practical skills like weaving, agriculture, cooking, and masonry. The liberal arts were thus those befitting of free persons, free citizens in society. The liberality of the liberal arts also has come to place a high value on the liberty to seek truth where it may be found. That is, liberated from any external forces of coercion, authority, power, utility, pragmatism, social norms, or private interests compromising or constraining such a search. This commitment to a radical freedom of thought, freed from the hegemony of the status quo or the consensus view, is why, at least in the strictest kinds of great books departments, the use of discursive introductions, commentaries, or extensive lectures is really strongly discouraged. This is precisely why the great books professor styles herself not as an authoritative expert in the field, but as a dialogue partner and fellow inquirer into truth, a role which Pierre Hadot has in another context called the friendly combatant, an interlocutor whose presence is necessary for preventing the interchange between student and teacher from devolving into dogmatism or the merely theoretical, and to ensure it remains a concrete and practical exercise. Indeed, the entire pedagogical procedure of dialogue, we think of the Greek dialegein, welcoming a difference, it's the other, especially as curated in a great book seminar setting, is predicated upon an otherness, which is fundamental, irreducible, and final. This taxonomy of otherness includes texts from a rich community of thinkers that are temporally, geographically, and ideologically different from ourselves, the otherness of the community of students who have theological and religious differences, different confessional allegiances, different races, socioeconomic backgrounds, and political affiliations, not to mention all manner of explicit and implicit biases, commitments, and presuppositions operating beneath our readings that come to light through an honest confrontation with the texts and with each other. Moreover, to read and discuss widely in the liberal arts is to come to see a wide range of the patterns of human behavior, to expose and evaluate a full slate of possibilities of forms of human life. Heroes, villains, statesmen, matricides, patricides, philosophers, lovers, wanderers, saints and sinners, pilgrims, mothers, fathers, poets, the bereaved, kings, travelers, contemplatives, prisoners, theologians, politicians, knights, actors, mystics, idealists, pragmatists, monsters, friends, scientists, the visible, the invisible, the powerful, and the weak. It is also to come to see that some enterprises are their own reward, not for anything, not economized into profit or the crassness of gain, which chides in a small but I think significant way the calculus that human persons can be measured in terms of use, commodity, economy, or exchange value, and to reprove the supposition that human persons who can produce nothing practical or saleable, the unborn, the aged, the dying, the ill, those with profound physical or mental handicaps, compromise, as Evangelium Vitae tells us, the well-being or lifestyle of those who are more favored, and tends to be looked upon as an enemy to be resisted or eliminated. Now I'll turn briefly to the second resource in the liberal arts, the exposure of force precisely as force. I want to suggest that sustained engagement with the liberal arts tradition, particularly again texts from ancient Greece, confirms the stark, unvarnished reality of the horror of force that gets tidily masked in contemporary discussions of beginning and end of life issues, where force is deployed just as vehemently against the weakest and the most defenseless members of a society. There are myriad examples, but in the interest of time, I will surface only a few. In Book 7, which we read today in class, for those of you who are in my class, in his History of the Peloponnesian War, Thucydides narrates the terrible massacre of the city of Mycalessus by a mercenary army who was motivated by self-interest, as an example of the exercise of power without justice. Here's the relevant excerpt from the text. The Thracians sacked the houses and temples and butchered the inhabitants, sparing neither youth nor age, but killing all they fell in with, one after the other, children and women, even beasts of burden, whatever other living creatures they saw, Everywhere confusion reigned and death in all its shapes, and in particular, they attacked a boys' school, the largest there was in the place, into which the children had just gone, and massacred them all. In short, the disaster falling upon the whole city was unsurpassed in magnitude and unapproached by any in suddenness and in horror. Some commentators have remarked that this episode of indiscriminate killing of innocents is a microcosm of the larger text, which reveals the dangers inherent in the assertion of total power in the pursuit of universal empire. Indeed, the account does harken back strikingly to the Malian dialogue, Thucydides' dramatic set piece of Book 5, that recounts the fate of a small, defenseless, neutral island of Melos, in which the Athenians say famously, but without any guile, "You know as well as we do that right, as the world goes, is only in question between equals in power, while the strong do what they can and the weak suffer what they must," end quote. Furthermore, the Athenians in this dialogue explicitly disallow the Malians for invoking justice as an objective category to which they can appeal to prevent the exertion of such force. So here we see force not only unmixed, but unmoored from truth, rationality, and goodness. But I want to say in the strongest possible terms that we should read Thucydides' phrase, "as the world goes," not at all with relief and nostalgia for times long past, but rather with the immediacy of a profound recognition, even if this unpleasant but no less pressing truth has become screened and domesticated by the mask of pleasantly democratic sounding language. It is as John Paul II has said, that when rights are no longer founded upon the sacrosanct principles of human dignity, they instead are made subject to the will of the stronger part. When the truth of justice no longer obtains, the state arrogates to itself the right to dispose of the life of the weakest and most defenseless members, from the unborn child to the elderly, in the name of public interest, which is really nothing but the interest of one part. The problem that we've inherited, but which is disguised, is that the only recognized subject of rights is, in J.P. II's words, the one who enjoys full or at least incipient autonomy and who emerges from a state of total dependence on others. For vulnerable persons who do depend entirely upon others for their well-being and existence, it turns out that it is only force which is the final criteria for choice and action in interpersonal relations and in social life. We're living in a terrible cultural contradiction, which has somehow married the high value given to rights language with an all too easy justification of the threats on fragile, vulnerable human lives who cannot defend themselves. Of course, I can't speak on the topic of force in classical Greek literature without mentioning at least Simone Weil's essay on Homer's Iliad, which was written in 1940 as a kind of meta-commentary on the Second World War. It's called the Iliad, or the Poem of Force. Some of you may know it. She suggests that force, quote, that X that turns anybody who is subjected to it into a thing, is, more than Hector, Achilles, or any other figure who appears in this sprawling epic narrative, actually the main character of the story of the Trojan War. She goes on, "For those dreamers who considered that force, thanks to progress, would soon be a thing of the past, the Iliad could appear as a historical document. For others, whose powers of recognition are more acute and who perceive force, today as yesterday, at the very center of human history, the Iliad is the purest and loveliest of mirrors." What we see in Weil's opening salvo is already densely and exactly right. We are horribly mistaken if we think that modern progress has decentered force from the very center of human history, even if we have lost the language and maybe even the courage to call it what it is. To conclude, I'll draw our attention to a later passage from Evangelium Vitae, which recommends as a kind of broad cultural therapy the fostering of a contemplative outlook, encouraging a perspective of those who see life in its deeper meaning, who grasp its utter gratuitousness, its beauty, and its invitation to freedom and responsibility, those who do not presume to take possession of reality, but instead accept it as a gift, discovering in all things the reflection of the Creator and seeing in every person his living image. My claim tonight is as modest as it is critical, that a contemplative engagement with the liberal arts can be a fragile sign of contradiction in a dominant cultural context which privileges the exercise of individual rights, autonomy, power, profit, novelty, convenience, and efficiency. Therein is the possibility of seeing things as they are, of naming reality with a greater sense of poetry, but also exactness, of coming to know the world not only intellectually, but bodily, viscerally, effectively, of receiving a tradition in the mode of gift as a wisdom not of our own making, to learn to act in cooperation with instead of opposed to the vicissitudes of our own nature, to learn how to be generous and to embrace the vulnerabilities of life, to learn how to be wrong, how to die well, how to cultivate genuine and virtuous friendship, how, when necessary, to be a gadfly, and how especially to be liberated from capitulation to our own biases, passions, prejudices, partial points of view, egoism, popular opinion, and social convention, as well as those of others. But far beyond, and I would venture to say, even the fulfillment of these literary and philosophical figures and tropes from the liberal arts, stands the humble, gentle Christ, himself the divine friend and brother of all the vulnerable silent ones who have repeated variously in history a radical susceptibility to the machinery of force. The New Testament teaches us that Christ's revolutionary self-gift, his free entrance into fragility and vulnerability, suffering and death, is in point of fact the truest form of power and the only one that can contain force. In the book of Revelation, among all the powers and principalities, it is only the little wounded lamb, slain by love before the foundations of the world, who has the power to open the seals of the scroll. The Gospels, in their strength and in their simplicity, not only expose the operation of force even more insistently than the ancients do, but they also utterly refigure and transfigure it, swords into plowshares. Though the Greeks provide well enough a phenomenology of force, it is not until the Gospels that we come to know how and by what means it can and will be undone. Thank you.
Thank you, Professor Martin.
Hi, everyone. My name is Caroline O'Callahan. I'm the co-chair of the Bread of Life dinner, along with Jack. We are just about ready to begin the question and answer period. I'll invite Professor Martin to come up in just a minute to the podium to answer any questions from the floor. Spencer and Will have microphones in the back, so they'll come to you. You can just stand up. In the meantime, during the question and answer period, please continue to enjoy your desserts and coffee. A few quick notes. So when you have a question, please raise your hand and they will come to you, Spencer or Will. And please introduce yourself, your year, and your major before you ask your question. And then we will wrap up around 7:50, or actually later, because the time changed. So we'll wrap up in 10 minutes. And at that time, Professor Sneed will come up and close out the evening. So with that, it's my pleasure to invite Professor Martin back up to the podium.
Let's start with some softballs. What do you think?
Hi, my name is Steve Evanson, Master of Theological Studies, first year Moral Theology, concentration. So I've heard you talk a lot about how the language of rights and freedom actually conceals force and uneven power dynamics. And that had me thinking about the fact that those of a certain political persuasion often talk about how those of a religious persuasion will advance religious arguments and how that conceals power dynamics and just the desire to suppress certain individuals. It was interesting that you kind of turned that on its head, basically said we can, two can play that game. So kind of thinking of the prophet of suspicion, hermeneutics of suspicion, people like Nietzsche and so forth, the French thinkers and so forth. I'm wondering if that's kind of, you had some of that in the background, you didn't explicitly say some of those things, but that seemed to be, I was picking up on that vibe and wondering if that was running through your mind?
Thank you so much. That's a really interesting question. I wasn't thinking of that, but now that you say it, I think I might have internalized some of that worry, because at least in our curriculum, we go through chronologically, basically through the Western canon, and when we get to Sim 3 is kind of like this highlight of Catholic culture. We read Aquinas, we read Dante, we read Don Quixote, we read all these really interesting, Teresa of Avila, Julian of Norwich. And then when we get to Sim 4, 5, and 6, we get into kind of philosophical modernity, and we read Hobbes and Kant and Darwin and Freud and Marx kind of all in a row. A lot of Nietzsche as well. So I think I do maybe have a sort of worry, even though I think it's really important to read these texts. We were actually talking at our table, like what happens when you're reading things chronologically, and then you sort of see that suddenly the floor is being pulled out from these assumptions that you've made about being and metaphysics and philosophical kinds of assumptions, about being able to access truth, those kinds of questions. You feel a certain kind of inarticulable uneasiness about that. And so that kind of felt experience, I think, of reading texts and knowing especially that we are not, the way we think about truth and what counts as evidence and what counts as real isn't the obvious position, right? We've inherited a kind of long tangle of philosophical assumptions, and we need, I think, to be able to have the resources to say, this isn't just the natural way of thinking, this isn't just the enlightened way of thinking. We have a longer history, we have a longer tradition. So I think, thank you for your question. That's very helpful.
Thank you for your talk. My name is Noelle Johnson. I'm a senior theology and physics major. And my question is, at the beginning of your talk, you mentioned when you have Jonathan Swift's essay, it provokes this sort of visceral reaction. You just immediately know how horrible that is, and that teaches you what you believe. I was wondering, do you think we even have that today anymore? Is it just a question of our language that has desensitized us, or we have we been desensitized to the actual horror of these acts? And if so, is there any hope of recovering that?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that's a hard and good question. I think it's all kind of tangled up in how we think about. So it seems like in contemporary idiom, we talk a lot about how we feel. It's a very relativistic kind of idea, right? Like, well, that's not my truth, that's your truth, that kind of idea, right? So we have this sense that that most of our reactions to things or feelings about things or thoughts about things are only in the realm of personal opinion, therefore they are unassailable, right? And so I think that is kind of a massive cultural problem, which, what I'm trying to say, I think at least implicitly, is knowing our history, having those feelings where there's a kind of assumption about truth and its accessibility in our tradition. It does kind of maybe let us know what's missing by way of lack. But I'm such a sort of optimist at the end of the day, I don't want to say that we're too far gone, right? Because, there are things, right, that are beautiful and that are modern and that strike us. Poetry, for instance. You read lines of poetry and you're like, oh, I know that, right? It's a recognition, right? And so I think novels, fiction, art, all those kinds of things compel us and resensitize our desensitized perceptive faculties. I feel like in sort of a deliberate engagement with that kind of stuff is a sort of therapy. It's really what St. John Paul II was saying at the end of his Evangelium Vitae, like what we need to do is we need to do these things that aren't commodifiable. I always like this, that Wendell Berry's poem, what's it called? The Mad Farmer's Manifesto or something like that, where he says, every day do one thing that will not compute. And I've always liked that line, right? Because it's just, it's a way of like acts of resistance about that. So I think there's, insofar as we are human, and insofar as we can and do have the capacity to recognize beauty and truth, it's just been, we have so many accretions and assumptions kind of hurting our perceptive ability. But I think we can sort of act as sort of therapeutic on ourselves by reading, by having conversations. I really do think at the end of the day, we're not too far gone, but it's harder, I think. It's a great question. Thank you.
Hi, I'm Nat Brown. I'm a first-year MBA. My question is talking about the liberal critique as a tool for promoting life. I'm wondering if you have any thoughts on political liberalism and specifically the debate going on in a lot of Catholic intellectual circles about how, devoted Catholics should be to political liberalism as an ideal. Thanks.
Mm-hmm. I think my main concern is echoing John Paul II's concern that rights language buries of violence against the disenfranchised. I am reluctant to speak too much about sort of political identity and that kind of thing. But I do think that for a Catholic, it's very difficult to find a home and to be compelled to find a home in either of the parties that we have. I'm not sure that actually answers your question, but to be a Catholic is already to be the gadfly, right? To say like, yes, this, but not quite. So I'm not sure I'm really answering your question, but maybe we'll talk after. Yeah, good.
Hello, I'm Zeph Snarkovich. I'm a sophomore PLS. I'm in Professor Martin's class. So today we talked about the Melian dialogue, and that's placed in the context of a treaty. The Athenians are trying to establish an alliance with the Melians, and my question is, well, you see, there's this discussion of friendship and alliances in Thucydides, and I was wondering if maybe there's we're kind of missing friendship in our modern culture, and have we regressed to these weak alliances, or maybe you could speak about the topic of friendship in this culture.
Mm-hmm.
Thank you.
Well, that's a really beautiful question. We were talking in class today about the fragility of these peace treaties, which only serve to kind of disguise war. Just the war was kind of undercover a little bit. There's been a very good conference on friendship recently that I attended, and I think you're absolutely right. And the need for that conference was very. Was profound because you're right. I mean, we collect, Facebook friends. I don't know, do the kids still use Facebook these days? I don't know. Is that their parents' generation? But this idea that those are the kind of like transient digital kinds of things, and what does it take to learn to be a friend and to learn to make a genuine friend. To love the same things, right? That's what being a friend is, right? To recognize someone and say, oh, we care about the same things. I wonder, especially, for people who are older, in their 30s and 40s, it's very difficult, I think, to make genuine friendships, But I think that's part of, like, in the response earlier to your question, I think that's part of the therapy. Because what does a friend do? A friend will tell you, you're wrong about this, or we'll call things into question. We'll kind of be the mirror that you need to be truthful, and we'll be supportive. I think that's a really insightful way of thinking about friendship as a cultural therapy. That's really, really helpful, Zeph. Thank you.
And Zach, I'm a fourth year mechanical engineering student in the Da Vinci concentration. I was wondering about, so basically your discussion of like liberal arts learning was primarily focused, I think, on higher education. But I was wondering basically what you thought of how to incorporate that into elementary and high school education.
Yes, so important. One of the things that our department does, which I think is really, really great, is a junior great books program for disadvantaged urban schools in the area who don't have anything like that. And so we go and we use these books, and it is incredibly important. The other thing that's not elementary or high school, but that we also have done in the past is a masterpieces class, a great books class that we teach at the Center for the Homeless, which is like the most moving thing, right? I mean, these people are experiencing the sort of vulnerabilities that we read about in these Greek tragedies. They're walking on the streets, sort of clutching a Norton anthology. I mean, like it's like too much to bear, like the pathos of it. But we have these same conversations there. So, I mean, I've been involved with a lot of book groups and various outreach kinds of things. There's another organization that's not affiliated with the university called Books at Work that I've worked with, who, will go into like the Detroit police force and have policemen and urban youth talk about a story together for no other reason but to talk about this book. I've run some of those kinds of things. And I feel like when you have a narrative that you can point to and sort of say, here's the sort of symbolic world where we can talk about things sort of slantwise, we can talk about them by other means. It's a really beautiful thing, the sort of trust that develops when talking about narrative, which isn't, exclusive to a classroom, for sure. But thank you for your question.
Thank you. Everybody, we're so fortunate to have someone like Professor Martin to come and think so deeply but also express everything in such a way that's so accessible to us. Please join me again in thanking her for her rich